This Shabbat, we have a double portion, the last two parshiot of the book of Shemot, of the book of Exodus, parshiot VaYakhel-Pekudei. There's also a special maftir, which is chapter 12 from Exodus, all the preparations which the Jewish people underwent before they left Egypt. So chapter 12, the maftir, we will actually be looking at in another 2 weeks in preparation for Pesach. Today, what I would like to do is to focus on the two parshiot, where the central theme of the two parshiot is the construction of the tabernacle and its utensils, the construction of the priestly garments. For those of you who have been with me over the last few weeks, I mentioned to you that our two parshiot, VaYakhel-Pekudei, parallel parshiot Truma and Titzaveh. In Truma, we're given the instructions for building the tabernacle, and in our parshat VaYakhel, we have the execution. And by the same token, in Parashat Titzaveh, we're given the instructions for the priestly garments, and we have the making of the priestly garments in Parashat Pekudei. So there's actually a question that I'd like to begin with, which is, given the fact that we saw the detailed instructions a few weeks ago in Parshiot, Truma, and Titzaveh, so why do we actually have two very, very detailed parshiot this week, parshiot VaYakhel and Pekudei, when we could have actually saved, and especially since I read Torah, so it could have saved me a lot of work, okay, by just simply writing. And the Jewish people did whatever God told Moses, and I refer you back to 2 weeks ago, and we could have said everything in maybe 2 sentences instead of in 200. Why all of the repetition? Why all of the details of how they ended up doing it? And so that's what I would like to examine tonight. And what I would like to begin with is by saying, or maybe let me actually, again, refer back to what we've spoken about in the past. A few weeks ago, I mentioned to you that there's a whole discussion among the commentaries as to whether the construction of the tabernacle is an ideal or whether it's something which is a concession to the Jewish people. Okay, by the way, Simon has posted a source sheet. And again, I apologize, these sources are in Hebrew. For those people who, when I make references, so we're not going to be following the source sheet. But if I make certain references, you'll be able to actually see the full reference on the source sheet in Hebrew. So let me just backtrack. There's a whole discussion among the commentaries as to whether the construction of the tabernacle is an ideal or whether it was in fact a concession to the Jewish people in the aftermath of the golden calf. And at the time, I was pushing the idea that the construction of the tabernacle is really an ideal, with the idea being that the tabernacle essentially is according to Nachmanides, the perpetuation of the revelation at Sinai. It's continuing Sinai if the Jewish people entered into a covenantal relationship at Sinai, which we could see as being a kind of marriage ceremony. So then we have the tabernacle where we now have God and the Jewish people living together, so that this is actually the ideal, that Sinai should not be a one-time phenomenon, but that Sinai simply ushers in an ongoing phenomenon of this interaction between God and the Jewish people, and in particular, the presence of God which dwells among the Jewish people. At the time, I also mentioned to you that there's a commentary, the Netziv, who's not alone, who says that the tabernacle, in a sense, is a blueprint for the world at large. And it becomes a kind of symbol with all the different elements that are there of what exists in the world at large, so that the idea of building a tabernacle is for the Jewish people to build a model for them to then extend out to what is going on in the world at large, and thereby to bring the presence of God not only in the tabernacle, but in the world at large. And tonight, what I'd like to do is to actually examine what I would call the process of building the tabernacle, and why that was so important and why that was so critical, and how it was done in terms of bringing the presence of God into the world. And I'd like to actually begin by saying that there are very interesting parallels, first of all, between the tabernacle and between Noah's Ark, which I'm not going to go into tonight, but I'm bringing it up because on a conceptual level, one could say that in the same way that there is a world which was destroyed and Noah is now creating what we could call the model for the new world order, which will happen in the aftermath of the flood. And that ark is somehow, with its all the details of its construction, creating a, even one might say, corrective for the world that's been destroyed. So the tabernacle is also ushering in a new world reality in the aftermath of the destruction of Egyptian civilization. But one thing which we don't have by Noah's Ark, which we do have by the tabernacle, is a detailed description of how he did it. It's very interesting if you go to chapter 6, chapter 7, okay, in Breshit, you'll see that after God gives Noah the instructions, it says, and Noah did whatever God told him, and that's it, without going into the details of what exactly he did. And as I said, the Torah finds it necessary to give us those details by the construction of the tabernacle. And if I take a different example, and you'll see in a few moments why I'm choosing this, we also have in Parashat Noach the story of the Tower of Babel, which is a major project that is undergone. And there are also certain parallel elements between that and the tabernacle. But perhaps the most significant difference is that the tabernacle is being commissioned, if you will, by God, human initiative, which is actually meant to replace God. So once again, I will not go into the details of the Tower of Babel. That's for another story, but I just want you to see there are very interesting parallels, contrasts. And so now let's look at what is it that makes the tabernacle so special. So I'd like to begin with a verse in our parasha. This is chapter 35, verse 4. The whole section of the construction begins with this verse. And Moshe said, El kol adat b'nei Yisrael lemor, to the whole community of the Jewish people. Okay, and here the word Eidah is very important because it is translated, I'm translating it as the community of the Jewish people. The word Eidah in Hebrew has at its root the word aid, which means witness, so that you could say to the whole community, which is a testimony. And he says to them, "Zeh hadavar asher tziva Adonai lemor." This is what God has commanded you to do, or saying. Now, it's very interesting that, as I said, the whole story of the construction is preceded with this idea that this is now being told to the whole community of Israel. And in fact, if you look subsequently, okay, you'll see that in verse 20, it says, "Vayetzu kol adat b'nei Israel milifnei Moshe," that the whole community of the Jewish people then go out from being before Moshe. And what is it that I would like to begin with? The tabernacle is essentially a construction of the total Jewish people. And this is the first element which becomes actually essential for the presence of God to dwell in the tabernacle. Everyone in the Jewish people needs to be involved. Everyone needs to be invested. And as we see when we go along, so different people will be involved in different ways. So perhaps let's just begin. If we look subsequently, this is, excuse me. Okay, let's start actually with verse 21. It says, "Vayavo kol ish asher nisa'o libo," and every man whose heart raised him up came. V'chol asher nadva rucho, and anybody whose heart was generous. And they came, heviu et trumat Adonai lemlechet ohel moed u'lechol avodato. They brought the, and here I'm translating it, contribution, donation to God, okay, to the work of the tent of meeting and its service, which means that there is one group of people whose job is to bring the raw materials. And in fact, if you look subsequently, right, look a few verses down, we have the following. It says, it gives you the listing of all the different materials. So we have, for example, 23. Anybody who had with him, tchelet, vargaman, blue and purple, tolat shani, red, dyed, all of these are dyed wool, v'sheish v'izim, and linen, and goat skin, vorot elim odamim, okay, and the skins of red, of red rams. All those people brought it. But now I want you to see that, in other words, it says, Kol asher nimtza ito, whoever had this, which means the people who had these various raw materials, they brought those raw materials. And then if you look subsequently in 24, Kol meirim trumat kesef u'nechoshet, those people who brought silver and gold or copper, heviu et trumat Hashem, those asher nimtza ito atzei shitim, who had sick, well, shitim is what's the English word for it? Forgetting my English. Okay, shita is a type of tree which grows in the desert. If anybody wants to put it on the chat, for those of you who are acacia, thank you, Michael. Okay, acacia wood, yes. Okay, so whoever had that, but the point which I'm trying to make is, there were those people that had silver and gold. There were those people who had dyed wool. There were those people who had acacia wood. So whoever had whatever, that was one group of people who then made their contribution. Then we had a second group of people, and I'll come back to this in much more detail in a moment, okay, who are the artisans, right? And as you see when we go subsequently, Moshe says in verse 30, right? Look, Moshe says to the Jewish people, God has called upon B'Tzalel and has filled them with wisdom. And then there are all these people who are artisans, who are now capable of actually building the utensils, That's a second group who are involved. And then the third thing, which I would like, or third group, right, which I shouldn't necessarily list as a separate group because it's really they're part of the other ones, are the women. Okay, and this is actually, I think, very striking because if you look at verse 22, chapter 35, verse 22, it says, Vayavau ha'anashim al hanashim. And the men came, and here I'll translate as with the women. And on my sheet, there are a number of commentaries who make the point that actually the women were in the forefront of making these contributions, and the men were coming, so to speak, on their tails. They were following them, which means that the women here played a very central role in contributing to the construction of the tabernacle. And not only that, but then we have in verse 25 and 26, it speaks about Isha chachmat lev biadeh tavu, but it speaks about the women who are involved in the weaving process, women who are wise of heart. Okay, and you have the next pasuk also of how the women are very much involved, not only in bringing the materials, but also very much involved in actually making the materials, in being the artisans. So I just want to point out for very often, right, when I used to teach in Pardes, so there was always a question, well, everything always talks about the men, well, but what about the women? What are they doing? Which is a very legitimate question. And all of a sudden I see when it comes to the construction of the tabernacle, the women are very much involved and are playing a very central role. The point which I want to make with all this is that Moshe speaks to the totality of the Jewish people and is in fact trying to get the totality of the Jewish people to be involved in the construction of the Mishkan, and he succeeds. Because what we find is across the board, everyone is involved in the construction of the Mishkan. In fact, one could say that on a certain level, the Mishkan is actually a very good, what we would call today, group building exercise. You want to bring a group together, so give them a major project and find a way of getting every single person involved. And that's how you actually bond a group together. By the way, I'll just say parenthetically, okay, because there'll be various other references I'll make, of course, during the course of the night. You want to build a shul, you want to build certain institutions. If you really want it to be something that's going to be viable and going to really have an impact, then you have to find a way of getting everyone involved in the process. And when you have a situation where there are a few people who are giving the money, and then another few people who are involved, okay, in overseeing, right, what's going on, right? We have a special committee that's doing it. It's all very nice, but it's actually missing an opportunity to have everyone involved and to encourage everybody to feel invested in what's happening. So that the more that everyone is invested, the more that this actually has a possibility of taking off. By the way, I just want to point out now, given what I said in the beginning today and what we discussed a few weeks ago, this idea of the unity, the total unity of the Jewish people, was actually a critical element at Mount Sinai. And I think I mentioned it a few times. If you go back to chapter 19 in Exodus, when the Jewish people come to Mount Sinai, in verse 2, it says how the Jewish people left Rephidim, They came to the Sinai desert. They encamp in the desert. And then it says, Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar, that the Jewish people encamp opposite the mountain, but the word Vayichan is in the singular. Previously, we were speaking in the plural. And you have a rabbinic comment which says that the reason for using the singular is Belev Echad Ki Ish Echad, with one heart as one person. And that's a central theme throughout the Sinai experience. The idea that when the Jewish people say later on in chapter 24, Na'aseh v'nishma, they say it in unison, all together. The sense of unity of purpose, is what enabled the Jewish people to then have the divine revelation at Sinai, to then go on to enter into a covenantal relationship with God. And it's that unity of purpose which is then reaching its climax in the construction of the tabernacle to ultimately create a permanent home for God. So that's the first point which I would like to bring out. That the Torah, in giving us the details of the process, the Torah wants to show us how everyone was involved in what was happening over here, and how this was actually the point to get everyone involved. Now we come to the next part, which is no less important. It's not only that everyone is involved in this process, but a major phrase or word which appears throughout in this section is the idea of the heart. And again, it comes up in a few different places. So I would like to examine this. The first place is if we look at chapter 35, verse 21, when it speaks about the people who are contributing, right, the materials. It says, Vayavo kol ish asher nisa'o libo, everyone whose heart is raising them up. And then it says, V'chol asher nadva rucho, anybody's heart who was, and the word nadva in modern Hebrew, linadev, means to volunteer, lehitnadev. So it's their heart volunteered them. But the word in modern Hebrew also, the same root, nadiv, is for somebody who's generous. And that's why some people translate the generosity of your heart. And the two obviously are complementary. But the point which I want to bring out with this, and this is a central point to the construction of the tabernacle, if you go back to chapter 35, verse 5, God says to Moshe, K'chu me'itchem, take from you, Truma Hashem, a contribution to God, Kol nadiv libo, everyone who is generous of heart, Yivieha, a Trumat Hashem, will bring this donation. And quite a few commentaries emphasize there was no order that was given to the people to contribute. The term that was used was that the people should be contributing from the generosity of their heart. In fact, what you find is that quite a few commentaries say that we didn't have what we would call tax collectors who would go around to everybody and demand, right, that everybody pay their dues. Instead, you had people who were appointed who were waiting for those people who, of the generosity of their heart, would come and contribute. Which means that the first element of heart has to do with the idea of the voluntarism, the generosity of the Jewish people. In no way was this something which was forced on the Jewish people. This is something which they did from the generosity of their heart. But then we have the second element, which I mentioned to you, kol asher nisa'o libo, anybody's heart who raises them up, which means it wasn't just that I'm being generous, but the sense that by actually giving, it's uplifting. People actually are now being raised up. And perhaps I would like to now just, again, parenthetically say how what's being described over here is something which is radically different than what the Jewish people experienced when they were in Egypt. Because one could simply say, well, in Egypt, the Jewish people, right, were now building this major project, these warehouses for Pharaoh. Some would say the pyramids for Pharaoh. And so now they're once again substituting God for Pharaoh. So instead of building a major project for Pharaoh, they're building a major project for God. But there are two differences in what I just described. With Pharaoh, the Jewish people didn't have a choice. With God, it was purely up to them what they contributed, how they did it. And with Pharaoh, the whole process of the Jewish people building the warehouses was dehumanizing, debilitating. The whole process of the Jewish people building the tabernacle is something that was uplifting. Rather than stripping them of their human dignity, it empowered them to the fullest with their human dignity. And then we come to the third part of the heart. And that is what comes up again and again when we talk about the artisans. We saw it before in chapter 35, verse 25, about V'chol Isha Chachmat Lev, the women who are wise of heart. And if you look subsequently in verse 35, it speaks about how God filled these people with Chachmat Lev, wisdom of the heart. What is wisdom of the heart? It's like a rhetorical question I'm asking now. I apologize for if anybody wants to write down on the chat, you can write down so that we'll make it. So the first thing which I want to speak about is actually something which the Abarbanel says, which is really very, very interesting. He said that the people who are now the artisans, the craftsmen, and by the way, the Abarbanel is not unique in this. There are quite a number of commentators who say this, are people who actually were not trained in these occupations. Okay, we're talking, about the Jewish people who in Egypt were doing menial jobs. And as I said, were pretty much dehumanized. So it's not as if they went and took a course in how do you build these different types of objects that we have over here. And it's not that they also had the experience of doing it. And the Abarbanel says, so who are these people? These are people who felt in their heart that they could actually rise to the occasion, that they could actually build this, that they could find from within themselves the wisdom to be able to do it. So that according to at least the Abarbanel, the wisdom of the heart is not the wisdom that you learned in school or the wisdom that you may have gathered from experience, but something which is within you, okay, which somehow you feel, and then it's as if now you're given the opportunity to take something which is within you and to then go ahead and do it. Perhaps something which is much more intuitive. Now that's one interpretation. But there's another way of looking at this, which I think is also important. that the wisdom of the heart is not only what we would call technical expertise, but the wisdom of the heart is also having what we could call the kavanah, to be able to have a sense of what is really the purpose of these utensils. What is it that we want to somehow convey, right? How do we want people to be inspired when they see this? And how do we make it in such a way that it will generate a certain message, give a certain inspiration to the people? It's not just looking at the technical aspect, but it's looking at the experiential effect of what this is. And this gets you into another area when we start describing the artisans. If you look at chapter 35, verse 30, or actually 31, it says, and God filled them with the Spirit of God. And this is talking about Betzalel, B'chochma, B'tvuna, B'da'at, Uv'chol melacha, Lachshov machashavot. Right? We talk about Chochma, Tvuna, or for those of you who be more familiar, Bina, Da'at, right? The acronym for Chabad. And Chochma, Bina, Badat are three different levels of wisdom. Chochma is just what we might call today knowledge. Bina is insight, the ability to take your knowledge and apply it to all kinds of situations. What's Da'at? Well, Da'at is seen as being somehow something much more, how should I put it, amorphous. It's like having intimate knowledge, having a deeper knowledge to the point of divine inspiration. These are different levels of knowledge, of understanding. And then it says also in the next verse, Lachshov machashavot, to think different things. What does it mean to think? So there are certain commentaries, and I'm paraphrasing this, who say to think means out of the box. To be able to now like have a whole way of looking at something which is unconventional. And this is what these artisans are. These are people who now are not just people who are smart, don't just have technical expertise. A large picture, they're perhaps also able to find a way to transmit that larger picture to the people. I want to say I had experience with a few. They described to me the process they went to as to how they built the shul. What were the different considerations they have? Right, and I'll just tell you, I davened. This was 30 years ago. I won't tell you where, but I was living in a certain neighborhood in Jerusalem, and there was a very famous architect who built the shul, and his baby, so to speak, was the roof. He wanted to have a roof that was like this curved roof, very high roof. It was, based on a model of a church, you could say. And you said to yourself, like, so why? Why was this so important? It was so important because it gives you a feeling of majesty, of gravitas. You come into this place and you all of a sudden feel like you're in this huge space, right? And the only problem is that it's also kind of very impractical, because if you have a big roof, it's very hard to heat it up in the wintertime. And not that, but because he wanted to have a very big roof, and this is an Orthodox shul, so then it meant he had to cut down the women's section, because if you would have made the women's section, which was on the balcony, right, a little bit more extended, it would take away from the effect of the roof, which means that you're therefore then limiting the number of people that you have there. Now, the other side was also that by making this big roof, yes, you created a sense of awe, but it also created a certain sense of alienation between the people, because it's like people felt a little bit lost and you didn't feel a real sense of intimacy and community. Now, the flip side of that is a friend of mine was very involved in the construction of another shul. He was a civil engineer, and he started telling me how the exact opposite, that they built the shul in such a way that they wanted to be very, very intimate and people would feel very close to each other, even though it was a place that could seat 300 people. And then they also built the women's section in a certain way, where the women's section was on the same level as the men's section and where it was see-through, and whereas, so that on the one hand, the women, like, were separated from the men, but on the other hand, they still felt very much part of what was going on. And then they also built it in such a way that the windows, right, would let in the light so that it was really lit up and it was created a very positive, warm atmosphere, but you couldn't see outside the windows, so you wouldn't get distracted, so that your whole focus is in what was going on inside the shul. Now, what am I trying to show you? That when you start building something, it takes a lot of thought. And then the question is, and you think about, like, so what is it that I want to create over here? What is the effect that I want to have? How is this going to create a dynamic in terms of my relationship with God, in terms of my relationship with the people? And that takes wisdom of the heart. By the way, I think everybody realizes that what separates, let's say, good artists from great artists, good musicians from great musicians, is you can use the same, materials, you can use the same techniques, and yet the difference very often is, what do you bring to there? Your soul. How much do you bring yourself to it? And as a result of that, what's the passion that you have in what you bring? And how does that come across in the work that you created? So that the whole idea of the heart becomes very important in terms of the giving of the materials, in terms of the construction, because kavanah, the ability to connect with what's going on, is at the core of this. We don't just want to have a building, but we want to have a building which is going to be meaningful, which people can relate to, when they build it, and which subsequently, when it will be in operation, because of how you related to it in the building process, that will then have its impact in its day-to-day functioning. So that the idea of the heart is central to what's going on over here. And then we get to another part. Oh, by the way, maybe before I leave, okay, we'll go to the next part and I'll bring some of these things together. The next part is something which I mentioned a few weeks ago, but now I want to examine a little bit more now. I brought you a verse earlier, right? Chapter 35, verse 5, which describes the contribution to the tabernacle. And the way it's described is, tiruma. Truma, which I translate as a donation, a contribution. But a number of weeks ago, I mentioned the idea that truma is related to the word in Hebrew, leharim, to raise up. With the idea being that what we're doing now is actually raising up these materials. We're sanctifying them. We're infusing them with spirituality. And by the way, this idea is similar to what I said earlier about the people whose hearts raise them up. And I said earlier about how the people are now being elevated by being involved in this process. The materials are being elevated. And here I want to look at two things that are interrelated to make the point. If I look at chapter 35, verse 22, when it starts speaking about how the men are following the women in terms of the contribution of materials to the tabernacle, it then gives me a whole list of what's being contributed. So it talks about how it says, Heviu, they brought, Chach, Vanezem, V'tabat, V'chumaz, Kol Kli Zahav. Now, Chach, Vanezem, Tabat, V'chumaz are all different types of jewelry. You could say nose rings, earrings, just finger rings. Kumaz is another type of, it could be a bracelet, or it could be actually something that was used on different parts of the female body, okay? Private parts of the female body that were used. Now, normally you would say that jewelry perhaps is not necessarily something that would be appropriate to be brought to the temple, and is not necessarily used for the most holy of purposes. And in fact, if I jump for one moment, if you look at chapter 38, we have a very interesting verse, chapter 38, verse 8, where it says, Vayas et hakior nechoshet, and he made the laver out of copper, that kano in its base, nechoshet, out of copper, bimarot hatzovot, with the mirrors of the, I will translate this, the armies, asher tzavu petach ohel moed, of the armies that were standing at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So now here I have the wash basin that the priests would use to wash their hands and feet before they would do the service. It's made out of copper, but copper which is made from the mirrors of these women who are the troops. So it's interesting. I'll give you two interpretations over here, and you'll see in a moment why I'm bringing this up in this context. One interpretation, which the Ibn Ezra says, is that who are these women who are, and by the way, I just want to say this now, the word tzava, which in modern Hebrew means an army, and one could say even in the Tanakh, it seems to be associated with an army. So I'll just say to you that it doesn't have to necessarily have to have militant connotations. Essentially, the word tzava means any type of organized group that has a very clearly defined purpose. And here, so the Ibn Ezra says, what are we talking about? We're talking about getting together who are now coming to the temple at the tent entrance of meeting, who want to just pray and study Torah, and they are now contributing their mirrors as a way of saying, we don't need these mirrors anymore. These mirrors, which once we used to look at, right, to beautify ourselves. One might even say, although I have to be careful, right, to objectify ourselves, right? And where we were so preoccupied with how we look, okay? We're now foregoing all that. We're giving that up because that's not really what matters in life. What matters is to be able to now hear the word of God. And as a result of that, we now want to just come and be by the tabernacle, to be praying, to be studying Torah. Now, okay, there are some people who want to make an analogy here between, maybe this and the women of the wall, but, I leave that to you if you want to make any comparison. But in any case, the point which I want to make over here is that the mirrors, at least according to this understanding, were used or may have been used for very narcissistic purposes, but now these mirrors have a much, much different meaning. If anything, these mirrors, by being contributed to the temple, to the tabernacle, are now an expression of how we've now a completely different type of orientation. By giving this to God, it's a way of saying, God, this is our sacrifice. This is what we are now reneging on, because what we want to do is to serve you. And in fact, we want this to be used now in service of God rather than in self-service. Now, that's an interpretation given by the Ibn Ezra. But in fact, if you take what I was saying before, these mirrors, which previously were used, as I said, for self-service, are now being given over for service of God, for a quote unquote more holy purpose. There's an interpretation which is given by Rashi based on a midrash that says that who are these women who are contributing their mirrors? These are the righteous women who in Egypt, when Pharaoh made his harsh decrees and enslaved the men and had them doing all these different types of very, as I said, dehumanizing jobs, and where the men were broken by Pharaoh, where the women used the mirrors to somehow revive their spirit. And in the words of the Midrash, the women, when the men were working really hard, the women would somehow arrange to meet the men for a few minutes when they were quote unquote off duty, and would then bring them food and bring them water and try to somehow encourage them. And even more than that, they would bring their mirrors and would start, quote unquote, playing games with the men, looking in the mirror. But according to the Midrash, they were even trying to seduce them, to arouse them sexually, so that the men would actually have sexual relations with them and ultimately would produce children. And what was motivating the women was a sense to say to the men, don't lose your faith. Don't lose your humanity. The mirrors became the instrument of seduction, but of seduction for a very, very positive purpose, for a holy purpose, for maintaining the dignity of the men, for ultimately perpetuating the Jewish people, for maintaining their faith in themselves and in God. And so what I'm just trying to show you is that a mirror a priori could be seen, and in the words of one Midrash, there were people who actually got very upset when the women were contributing the mirrors. They said, this is what you're contributing to the temple? This has no room in the temple. And the response of Moshe is, yes, it does. Because ultimately it's a function of the intentionality. And these mirrors reflect an expression of holiness. And therefore, on the contrary, they belong in the temple. And it's with these mirrors that the high priest every day will prepare himself by washing his hands and give him the quote unquote right intentionality for the service that he's about to do. So what I've tried to show you is that in the process of building the Mishkan, the idea that the Jewish people were all united in this project, that there was the realization that for this project to work, it needed everybody's participation, everybody according to the generosity of their heart, everybody who was being asked to rise to the occasion. It required the heart of the people for the people to, as I said, to have that generosity of heart, but also to have the wisdom of the heart for this to work. And by having those different elements, this is what in the end infused this with sanctity and made the Mishkan a place worthy of having the presence of God dwell in it. I want to now point out another element, and also to show how what's happening here in the Mishkan is something that was radically different than what happened with the golden calf. In the case of the golden calf, yes, people contributed their gold. In the case of the golden calf, okay, we have the people gathering together. But the difference is very significant. In the case of the golden calf, there was not that sense of unity where everyone was involved, everyone each in their way to make it happen. It seems to be that it was a relatively small percentage who were involved. In the case of the golden calf, there was a lot of impulsivity in how people acted. It wasn't thought out. And now I also want to bring up another element, which I want to take in two directions. When the people make their contribution, we have something which is probably unique in Jewish history. And what do I mean by that? If you look in chapter 36, verse 4, when the people are making their contributions, it says, Vayavo kol hachachamim, and all of the wise men, all of the artisans who are involved, osim et kol melechet hakodesh, who are involved in this holy work, right, to do it. Ish mimlachto asher hema osim. Each one, right, in the specific job that he was doing, now comes to Moshe. And what does he say? What do they say? In verse 5, Vayomru Moshe lemor, they say to Moshe, Marbim ha'am lahavi, the people are bringing too much. Midei ha'avodah lamlacha, right? More than what we are able to handle. And then in verse 6, Vayetzav Moshe, Moshe commands, Vayaviru kol b'machaneh, and he sends out, right, instructions in the camp. Ish v'isha, that men and women, al yasum od melacha l'trumat hakodesh. They shouldn't do any more work in their donations. And then the people stop. As I said, this is the first time where you actually have to tell people to stop contributing. And what's fascinating, right, which is they actually listen. Now you'll say, sure, why wouldn't they want to listen? Okay, but it's not so simple. The idea that people don't get carried away with what they're doing, don't become obsessed with what they're doing, that's also a very important statement. And so what I would like to also end with is actually the beginning of the Parsha. Before we start talking about the construction of the tabernacle, we have three sentences which seem to be kind of out of place. And if you look at the first opening sentences of the Parashat, chapter 35, verse 1, it says Moshe gathers together, again, the whole community, totality of the Jewish people, and he says to them, these are the words which God is commanding you to do. 6 days work shall be done, and on the seventh day it shall be holy, a total cessation to God. Whoever does work on that day will die. And then it goes on to say, Lo tivaru eish. Do not transfer fire, burn fire. B'chol moshvotechem, in all of your habitations, b'yom HaShabbat, on the Sabbath day. So, why are we bringing up the laws of Shabbat over here? And to be honest, I was actually thinking originally of talking about the whole development of the laws of Shabbat for this session, but I guess I couldn't resist talking about the tabernacle. But I would still want to get Shabbat in. And Shabbat actually comes up in a few different places, right? Everybody's familiar with the Ten Commandments. In chapter 20, remember the Sabbath day, don't do work. And then we have subsequently in chapter 31, right, where it says, V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat, which we read last week. And now we have in this week's section. And there's the question, like, why each time do we give you like bits and pieces about Shabbat? Also, I didn't mention, we also have by the manna, which is really the first time where we start getting laws of Shabbat in chapter 16 in Exodus. So the general explanation that's given is the juxtaposition of Shabbat with the construction of the tabernacle in our section, and is twofold. The first thing is that the Torah is telling me that Shabbat takes precedence over the construction of the tabernacle. Even though this is such an important project, nevertheless, not on Shabbat. And number two, on the basis of what's done in the tabernacle, that is what is defined as what is considered to be work on Shabbat. Which means my definition of what is it that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat is based on what is it that you would do in the construction of the tabernacle. And so therefore, what I want to bring up now, for those of you who may not know, that my definition of work on Shabbat is not physical labor. It's not what we generally think, and that Shabbat, we stop it so that we rest. But my definition of work on Shabbat is what it actually says by the tabernacle. And here, just look at this in chapter 35, verse 33, where it describes the artisans. It says in the end, what is their job? It uses the word melechet machashevet, work which is thought out. Work which is thought out, work which is done intentionally, work which is, and now I'll use the language, creative work. And it has nothing to do with the amount of effort. It has to do with the element of creativity. And so now I would like to end with this point. It'll be a few moments, so bear with me. It's very interesting that in Hebrew, we have two words for work. One word is milacha, which comes up again and again in the beginning of our Parashat, chapter 35. But then there's another word for work, which is avodah. Now, these are two different words for work, but they're also two different meanings for what work is doing. Two different perspectives on what it is we do. And by the way, what I'm about to say, if you're going to probably talk to some Bible scholars, they'll tell you this is all wrong. But okay, you'll be the judge in the end, which one you think is right. What I would like to contend is that the word melacha has at its root the word melech, which means king, majesty. The other word for work, which is avodah, has as its root the word eved, which is servant. And then the question is, when I'm doing something, What is that reflecting? So I would like to say that essentially the tabernacle and everything associated with it, a word which is key, is melacha. Because in this project of building the tabernacle, all of human greatness is coming out, especially in terms of the artisans. What they've created is a masterpiece, is monumental. In many ways, the tabernacle is the ultimate expression of human creativity, of human majesty. And by the way, that human majesty mirrors what you had in chapter 1 in Genesis. And for those of you who are familiar with the beginning of chapter 2, VaYakhulu hashamayim v'ha'aretz v'chol tzva'am, right, which we say every Friday night. VaYachal b'yom hashviim milachto asher asa. God completed milachto, which means that what God did during the 7 days of creation is called milacha. Why? Because creation is the reflection of God's majesty. It is the ultimate expression of God's creativity. And I would also add, it wasn't really such an effort on the part of God to do it. He didn't have to flex his muscles, so to speak. The Jewish people, when they are building the tabernacle, they are imitating God. They are calling upon all of their creative capacities to build something which is, as I said, monumental. That's melacha. And on Shabbat, we're told, stop. Yes, Bracha. Stop in what you're doing. Why? So on the one hand, what I'd like to say is we stop working on Shabbat because what we're doing is recognizing that ultimately we are not the masters. We are the servants. And by stopping, we're acknowledging the limitations on our work, on our mastery. And in fact, Shabbat is meant to be a day of service of God. So that 6 days show your human creativity, show how you're able to now shape, right, everything around you. But on Shabbat, this is a day dedicated to take on a different hat. Today, you're not a master. Today, you're a servant. And by the way, this concept becomes critical for the tabernacle. The tabernacle, as I said, is the ultimate expression of human creativity. But ultimately, the whole purpose of the tabernacle is to not be a monument to what we're able to create, but to be a house of worship of God, which means ultimately the purpose of all of that melacha is to then lead to the next phase, which is service of God. By the way, I'll just point out that the reason why you don't build the tabernacle on Shabbat is because you always have to keep in perspective. The purpose of this project is not to put human creativity on a pedestal. It's ultimately to serve God. Stop and recognize God. But now I want to just tell you, and by the way, as long since I mentioned it earlier, this is exactly the difference between the tabernacle and between the Tower of Babel. Because the Tower of Babel was a magnificent project reflecting human grandeur, but it was to put humanity on a pedestal as a replacement of God. And the tabernacle, as I said, is to serve God. But now I want to say something else, and this really, and by the way, okay, I'm sorry. This is also why in our section it says, do not use fire. Fire is at the core of all of the activities which are being done in the tabernacle. You'll excuse the pun, it fuels the whole project. Fire is the expression of human technology, the means for human technology. You can't do anything without fire. So that's why we have especially emphasized, don't transfer fire, because this is a way of showing, as I said, the limitations which you're accepting and recognition that ultimately this is for God. But now I'm going to say something else, which will sound contradictory to what I just said, but you can think about this. If people actually are able to stop working, then that's really what reflects their majesty. Kind of paradoxically. And what do I mean by that? And I'll give you an example. I have a cousin who at one point in my life was like a brother to me. I was very close to him. And this must have been about 30 years ago when I was making a trip to the States, and we were sitting and talking, and he was describing to me how he had set up a very successful chain of pharmaceutical stores. And then it came out that he said to me, and I worked 7 days a week. And I, in what I usually joke about, my non-coercive way, would said to him, well, wouldn't it be a good idea to take a day off and just be able to spend time with the family, right? Without getting into keep Shabbos, but just take a day off, spend it with the family, be able to rest. And his response, which I found very interesting, was that he said, I can't do it. I can't do it. He said, because it's a rat race. Because if I take off one day, then what will happen is I close my stores, then they'll go to my competition. And then it's not just they went to my competition on that day, but then they got used to going to somebody else. So then it'll do in my business. And it was at that point that I came up with this idea that, isn't it unbelievable that how much of a slave he is to his work? That how much he, in fact, is not really in control. It's like his work is controlling his whole life. And if he actually were able to take off that day and to be able to be confident that he could go back the next day and his world would not fall apart, that would really be majestic. That would really be showing his human grandeur. So that I just want to point out, it becomes really very interesting that actually by being able to stop ourselves, that's maybe what really shows that we're in control. And that's the message of Shabbat. And so that this is, in a certain sense, that this is also what separates the tabernacle from the golden calf. The moment the Jewish people started getting involved with the golden calf, it was possessive. It took them over. They couldn't stop. And it was like this, it was something which was completely out of control. And in a certain sense, this is how the Jewish people, quote unquote, enslaved themselves to idolatry. And the whole point of the Mishkan is not to enslave ourselves, but to, in fact, maintain our dignity. And yet at the same time, be able to do that in service of God. To be able to, when Moshe says, we don't need any more materials, to stop. And to be able to say that, yes, we don't need any more materials. And this is enough. and we'll manage, and it'll still be unbelievable. So that service of God is very much built on this idea of our majesty, not at the expense of it. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.